Hi everyone. As you know, you have your first draft of the How Does a Poet Make Meaning essay due next week. It's a problem-making draft or rhetorical situation draft. It's the same process that we applied to the In Defense of essay. The first draft was identifying your audience, the context, the problem, identifying then your purpose that comes out of that. So it'll be a shortened draft. That doesn't mean, though, that you should not develop as much of a problem making as possible, even though the length requirement says 1.5 to 2 pages. If you see yourself able to develop 2+ pages of problem making, identifying audience and what the problem is that you want to address, please do so. Make it longer. There's no harm in that. So today's going to be introducing that rhetorical situation draft, and then also introducing a couple ideas, posing a few questions to help you think about how to generate your audience and problem. And I'm going to use the discussion from your personal history with poetry as a foundation for that discussion as well. So I'm going to pull up this document here. First, going to read the prompt for the draft, and then talk about some of these considerations. So the prompt says, write a persuasive essay that develops a focused argument about how a poet makes meaning. Choose one of the 5 technical skills a poet uses to make meaning: line breaks, syntax, diction, tone, imagery, metaphor, sound, or form and pattern, and attempt to persuade your audience to understand poetry from a new perspective. Your essay must establish a complex context that has shaped your audience's old perspective. So the very foundation is that you are writing to an audience who doesn't understand, doesn't like poetry, has a misinterpretation of what it is. They have this particular view of it that is problematic. You can even think of the essay as a defense of poetry. Locate a personal connection to your audience and the topic, and feel free to use anything you've written or read up to this point to help you develop your argument. So that is, for instance, the exploratory draft 1 or 2 could be potentially applied to this essay as a whole. I'm not sure they'd be applied to this problem-making draft. Once you've practiced defining or explaining poetry and its skills and effects, and practiced analyzing a specific poem to show how the poet creates the poem's meaning, those were the exploratory drafts, you're ready to begin drafting the final essay. As we read more, make sure you continue to revise your definitions, explanations of poetry, and keep practicing analysis. I'll finish there, because this is just the overview of the how does a poet make meaning prompt. But specifically, we're going to have the first draft respond to the rhetorical situation. So it's responding to this idea of an understanding of an audience who misunderstands or doesn't understand poetry the way you want them to see it, and you need them to see it that way. The reason I had you read this is because even from the problem-making draft, you need to know what basically argument you're eventually going to make. Is your topic going to be line breaks and syntax? Is it going to be diction and tone? Is it going to be imagery, metaphor, so on and so forth? Because your problem that you're going to develop isn't just specific to what your audience thinks about poetry, but it could also be specific to what your audience thinks about poetry and its line breaks, or poetry and how it uses imagery, or poetry and how it uses sound. The problem doesn't stick with poetry in general, but can be specified into some of the techniques that your audience might have a problem with. So you need to be thinking about what you are going to write about in order to build a problem that is thorough and complex enough. The rhetorical situation draft says, just as you did with the first draft of the In Defense of essay, I'd like you to only establish the rhetorical situation for the first draft of the How Does a Poet Make Meaning essay. Your goal is to identify a specific audience you want to address and prove a problem that audience has with the topic you will write about, poetry, and the specific technique you will write about. So, You know the drill. You did it with in defense of. You're doing it again here. The question is, how are you going to do it here? The prompt actually says locate a personal connection to your audience and topic. Um, this was similar to the approach we took in the in defensive essay. A lot of you wrote to peers, almost like you were writing to your friends or a larger group of people you're associated with who don't find pleasure and enjoyment in your topic. You could take that same approach. The one specification I give to this essay and the audience that you write to is you have to write to a sophisticated, intelligent, mature audience. So let's go and assume that it has to be college age or higher. I don't want you writing to junior hires or to kids or to your you know younger cousins or something like that. You're writing to a sophisticated, intelligent audience. I think just saying college age is a good starting place for that. So that's my one specification for you to consider. The rest of the considerations are up to you. This document here talks about the three categories or three angles to consider when you're building your problem making. We're going to talk about those, and then we're going to look at specific problems that you began to identify in your personal history with poetry discussion and apply some of these categories even to these ideas and talk about how to extend these ideas further. So here are some poetry making angles to consider with this draft. Just identifying what is the current problem. So the prompt already gives you part of the problem. The current problem is that your audience doesn't understand and or like poetry. So that's kind of a given. The second part of this question that says explain the reasons or feelings why your audience doesn't like, understand poetry, that gets into the specifics. Why don't they like it? Why don't they understand it? Currently, to this day, if you walked up to someone who was part of your audience that said, what do you think about poetry? What would they say? That's the current problem. Second question says, does your audience prefer an alternative to poetry, or more specifically to images, diction, sound, lineation, etc.? So this is almost an extension of the current problem. It would be saying what the audience prefers instead. Oh, for instance, do you like poetry? Nah, I don't like poetry, but I like lyrics, and I'm really into song lyrics. Okay, they prefer an alternative. Why do they prefer that alternative? And potentially, what do you think is problematic about that alternative? That kind of leads us into the third question. How did this problem develop? So both the current problem and maybe the current preference for alternatives, how did this problem develop? Where does it come from? Yep. Your reader didn't just wake up one day and say, nope, don't like poetry, don't understand it, prefer these things instead. Yeah, it's a process, a string of experiences that have led them to this place where they have a particular point of view or perspective about poetry and its technical skills that is problematic. And you want to investigate that. That's going back. What's the history? How did that develop? So in this category, you can explain the personal, cultural, or educational experiences that have shaped the audience's view. Sorry for some typos. So I asked you in the discussion to share your personal history with poetry, and you shared your personal history. Now, as you did that, many of you started to introduce also that part of that personal experience was a cultural influence, or part of that personal experience was an educational influence. A number of you talked about being required to memorize poetry in school, but also in the home by parents or grandparents. And that comes from a cultural influence that, though not specifically stated in your discussions, has a specific reason. So you can ask questions about where that cultural influence or experience came from as well. A lot of you noted that you took AP English in high school and you analyzed poems, and the experience of analyzing poems in those classes was very difficult and uninteresting and confusing. So your personal intersected with the educational. But again, why? Why is poetry taught that way in high school? What did that influence come from? So on and so forth. So these questions or these categories can lead you on to a series of questions about where did that come from? Where did that come from? Why did that develop? Why is that the case? It's kind of questions you should be asking as you think about how your audience thinks about your topic and why. So let's expand on this list by looking at some of the problems you guys identified in the discussion we recently did. And these are not complete problems, of course. They're just very quick one sentence or two sentence statements of the problem. They don't get into the larger reasons or influences or experiences, or they don't combine all of these categories together, but they're starting points to ask deeper questions. Many of you noticed that I was asking questions and responding to your discussion to get you think about it more deeply, to think about where that came from, what you mean by that, what you think by that, so on and so forth. So let's just read through these and we'll just talk about some of them. And again, this is just a starting point for you to investigate what audience you're writing to and what problem you're addressing. It's specific not only to poetry, but also to the specific skills of poetry. So one of you said, I would prefer academic essays or scientific papers more. Okay, that covers number 2. I prefer something different. It's this idea of a form of communication, a form of making a message or creating a message or a purpose for an audience, but that you prefer academic essays and scientific papers more. So there's a preference, and we can ask the question why, explain the reasons why that's preferred. We can ask where that preference came from, how it developed, and that would be filling out the list. That same student also said and expanded, I find it very hard to enjoy a poet because I have difficulties getting a definite answer out of it. And so here it becomes a reason about where the preference comes from. And let me read the next one because it's from the same student as well. It says, the academic essays and scientific papers are concise and direct and give definite answers. Poems, on the other hand, are more like art. It presents artistic value rather than logical value. It is less direct, but more crafted. So now here are some reasons, and this is kind of just like the current reasons of why this student, and I'm using your responses as examples of that there's a current problem and there's a current alternative. Now, none of these get into how this developed, what personal, cultural, or educational experiences formed this, but at the very least, we have some interesting contrasts. Poems are less direct. They're not as definite or logical in the way that they present their value or present their message to the reader. And some readers don't like this. They're confused by this. Why? Why? Ask that question and you'll start getting into number 3, where most of your problem making will probably happen. So let's keep reading. Another student said, since English is my second language and I barely knew how to speak English, having to interpret the poem was really hard for me. And I ended up not receiving a good grade on the homework. So this covers a potentially very different audience, target audience, where if we took these as a jump start to develop a problem about poetry in general, not yet its skills, but poetry in general, well, there's this audience who prefers scientific papers. They prefer logical, definite, direct answers. So that makes up one kind of audience with a shared characteristic, and you can build a problem around them. This is a different audience. It wouldn't be the same one. It would be probably a different one. So you can imagine yourself writing to other students, an audience of intelligent, sophisticated, mature college students whose second language is English, and because it is, the vocabulary and the nuances of English syntax are a little bit harder to read and harder to interpret. And that's a potential audience too. You'd have to then keep going into, well, how did this problem develop? What are the experiences that kept these students from continuing to press hard into a reading of poetry to understand how it works? It's not good enough to build a problem that just says, well, they don't know the language, so that's the problem. That would only be a one paragraph problem making when it needs to be multiple pages. But it's still a potential jumping off point. Another one of you said, I love music and I sometimes like to write my own songs and create lyrics. So this goes back to an alternative. Well, I like writing and I like expressing my experience and my feelings and my thoughts in lyric ways, but I like that it's accompanied by song and by music. This is an alternative to poetry that an audience might have. We know that music is a very, very, very prevalent form of entertainment and lyrical expression in our culture. And so that could lead to a very thorough discussion of number 3, and even then the difference between poetry and song that creates this current problem or current perspective. Another one of you said, when I found that the topic of this 39A class is poetry, I'm very surprised because I've never heard another teacher choose poetry as a topic. To be honest, I have little cognition of poetry before this class because in most classes, teachers just ask me to read books or articles. So this is hinting at an educational problem. The way poetry is taught in high school, for instance, if it is taught at all, is very sketchy, to say the least. Most high school English teachers do not have a background or education in poetry, and maybe it seems like their understanding of the topic is limited as well, and so most teachers don't even choose it as a topic. They don't really focus on it unless it's a requirement, and so lack of exposure in education could be part of a problem. Something about that vocabulary could go to the problem of English as a second language, or it could just go to the fact that even if English is the first language, it still has a vocabulary that's not part of common everyday speech. That could be part of the problem. This goes back to that educational exposure. The most I've exposed to poetry would be English classes in high school, and we could talk about what's problematic about that. This next one talks about interpretation. I would always be frustrated when I would come up with the meaning of a poem only to have it completely wrong. I always wished that each reader could have their own interpretation of the poem, be correct as long as they could justify it as such. There is this idea with non-poetry readers that poetry is up for interpretation because it's kind of cryptic and puzzle-like, and it can have multiple meanings. People see it as having that opportunity to read it however one wants. And even in that place, people don't want to read it because they think it's too open for interpretation. It's not definite. It's not direct. So that could add to even the problem that we were talking about earlier. I'm not saying that this is a problem. His poetry is not necessarily open to mean anything anyone wants it to mean, but this could be part of your audience's perspective or point of view about poetry, which keeps them from understanding it and liking it. The last one says, I'm not excited to read poetry because I've always had a hard time analyzing abstract poems and finding the bigger picture or meaning of the poem. This is just kind of going to what is said in the prompt already. I don't know how to understand them. I don't understand poetry. I don't understand how they create meaning. I don't understand what they're trying to say. But we want to keep investigating. These are just starting places that I saw you talking about in your discussion. You want to apply this list of questions. Say as much about the current problem, as much about the reasons, as much about the alternatives, and as much about the history of this problem and how it developed as you possibly can for up to 2 pages, if not more. And so you really have to ask a lot of questions. What, why, how? These responses here only dealt with poetry in general. They didn't deal with the specific skills. Maybe this one did. This one got close because when you talk about music that accompanies lyrics, you can think of repetition of sound. Sound is a technical skill. This music has lyrics, which in a way, and some of you have had this experience, when read alone, don't seem to have a ton of artistic value. If you just read the lyrics on the internet without the music, you might not find the same depth and feel the same depth that you feel when the music accompanies it. Poetry, on the other hand, has depth of lyric, depth of words that it coincides with the sound that the words create, and that sound is a form of music. So this response maybe hints at a potential problem or perspective that your audience has about sound in poetry, that there's a preference for sound outside of the words, and that's why your audience prefers music. And there's a potential for an argument about the benefit of sound in poetry. So think about that. What does your audience prefer in terms of how they... I can get out of this. What does your audience prefer in terms of how they encounter images in their normal life? Social media, photography, television, movies, very popular in our culture. Everyone's a photographer. Everyone has a phone camera that takes really high quality photos, and everyone posts those and shares those, and we engage with the image. And images make arguments, they create meaning. But we prefer the visual image, not the written image. So is that potentially a problem to explore if you're going to write about imagery? Lineation. I mean, just the fact that it's so different. Everything, seemingly, that we read goes from left to the right margin. But poetry cuts it short. It has these line breaks, these stanza breaks, and just on the sheer fact that it's different from anything else we read, there's a potential problem that your audience has with the idea of lineation. Maybe you explore that, where did that come from, so on and so forth. So you have plenty to investigate, and I want you to think of the problem-making draft as investigatory, I guess you could say. Be a detective, try to figure out the current problem, prove the current problem by talking about how it developed, what reasons your audience gives towards it. And use the style portfolio skills, again, to build that problem. Use specific illustrations, your diction choices to establish tone, potentially imperatives, metaphors, and your own explanation of what the problem is to develop that. So I look forward to reading these, and I will see you soon.